presentation is based on Rene Guenon's book called The King of the World. Guenon's book emerged as a result of a conference that was held in 1924 to discuss Ferdinand Ossendowski's book, which was called Beasts, Men and Gods, and which told of the author's trips through Central Asia. The book was especially notable because of fantastic legends passed on to Ossendowski concerning the King of the World and his underground kingdom known as Agartha. Saint-Yves d'Alvedre had written, but not published, an earlier book in 1910 called Mission de l'Onde, which also contained descriptions of a mysterious place called Agartha, and the later accounts by Ossendowski are in some cases almost identical to the then unpublished accounts by Saint-Yves. Guenon rejects the notion that Ossendowski plagiarized the work of Saint-Yves, primarily because, as he says, stories such as both authors record abound in Mongolia and Central Asia, and indeed there are similar stories in the traditions of almost all peoples of the earth. Spelling discrepancies, for example, he attributes to Ossendowski receiving his information from a Mongolian source, whereas Saint-Yves received his information from a Hindu source. Regardless of potential plagiarism and so on, Guenon uses the accounts by these two authors as a springboard of sorts for his own wider investigation into what may at first appear to be fairy tales, but which, upon deeper consideration, are full of rich symbolism that may help to elucidate what Ossendowski himself called the mystery of mysteries. Guenon wanders and digresses and speaks about various matters which may seem somewhat tenuously linked to the central story of the King of the World, but it is all fascinating nonetheless. Guenon first looks at the title assigned to the King of the World. It corresponds, he says, to Manu, the primordial and universal legislator, whose name is found among so many peoples, Mina or Menes to the Egyptians, Men to the Celts, and Minos to the Greeks. The name is not related to a specific person, but rather to a principle, the principle that reflects pure spiritual light and formulates the law or the dharma appropriate to the conditions of the world in a particular cycle. The name Manu also relates to the archetype of thinking man, or as it is in Sanskrit, Manava. This principle, Guenon says, can be manifested through a spiritual center existing in the world by an organization that has been charged with the preservation of sacred tradition. The head of such an organization would be the representative of Manu. Such is the case with Agartha, the head of which fulfills both a royal and a sacerdotal function, that is, the roles of king and priest. Guenon notes the use of the word pontiff by Saint-Yves, a word which links both the royal and the sacred duties, and that pontifex means literally builder of bridges, that is, the mediator between this world and the higher worlds. Many traditions in the world have this symbol of the bridge. For the Hebrews, it is the sign of God's covenant with his people. For the Chinese, it is the union of heaven and earth. The symbol is there among the Greeks, Persians, Arabs, in Africa, and among the indigenous peoples of North America. Saint Bernard said that the pontiff is a bridge between God and man. Tales of obscure initiatic centres ruled by one who combines both royal and priestly duties have persisted throughout older times and among all peoples. In the early Middle Ages, for example, frequent mention was made of a mysterious region called the Kingdom of Prester John, who was a legendary Christian patriarch. The kingdom was said to be located in various places from India to Ethiopia. It is said that Genghis Khan once tried to assail this kingdom, but that he was repelled by thunderbolts unleashed against his armies. There is also the solar citadel of the Rosicrucians and Campanella's City of the Sun. In Arab lands, we have the Old Man of the Mountain, or the Guardians of the Holy Land. In the early days of Christianity, we also see the Magi Kings. By the later Middle Ages, in Europe at least, There was a separation of the functions between papacy and empire. The combination of the two roles, however, that of king and priest, continued in the East. The king of the world must have a regulatory or organizational function, a duty to preserve equilibrium or harmony, also known as dharma in Sanskrit. Fundamental attributes of the king of the world, as described by Ossendowski and Saint-Yves, are justice and peace. The word dharma is an interesting one. The root dri expresses the idea of stability, and the form dru is the root of dhruva, which is the Sanskrit name for the pole. Some connect this word to drus, which means oak. The word druids, whose name Guenon suggests could be read as druvids, vid meaning wisdom, derives from the word oak, the oak here representing the world tree or the fixed axis, the central pole. Guenon speaks now briefly about this symbol of the fixed point or pole, around which the world rotates. He returns to this later, but for now, suffice it to say that this symbol is often represented in the form of a wheel, such as we find among the Celts, the Chaldeans, and the Hindus. The Hindu swastika, for example, is much misunderstood, and is in fact a wheel symbol, though it does not display the outer perimeter, which represents usually the world of nature. The swastika symbolizes movement, though according to Guenon, this is specifically the rotational movement around a central or immutable axis. The fixed point at the center is the essential element in this symbol that must not be overlooked. The fixed pole, the axis. The symbol of the wheel crops up in many places, in Romanesque churches, for example, in the rose windows of Gothic architecture, in the symbols of the rose in the west and the lotus in the east. Guenon now makes a digression to speak of the Shekinah and Metatron. The title King of the World has caused some, he says, to make comparisons with the Prince of the World of the Gospels, but Guenon outright rejects this. He says that in Hebrew and Arabic, the title King of the World is readily applied to God. Guenon uses this as a launching point to discuss some aspects from the Kabbalah, most especially the theories of celestial intermediaries. To this end, he discusses the Shekinah and Metatron. As regards the Shekinah, a word whose literal translation means dwelling or settling, denoting the divine presence or settling of God, it is connected to the idea of a spiritual center, such as the tabernacle or the building of the Temple of Solomon. Guenon associates the Shekinah with Gloria and Pax, the inner and outer aspects of the presence of God. The consort of the Shekinah is Metatron. Among the suggestions for the etymology of this name is included the Chaldean Mitra, which is related to both rain and light. Rain, in many spiritual traditions, symbolizes the descent of spiritual influences from heaven to earth. The term Metatron conveys multiple meanings such as Lord, Messenger, and also Prince of the World. Metatron possesses not only the aspect of mercy, but also that of justice, therefore being not only the great priest, but also the great prince and the commander of the celestial hosts. Guenon also holds that Metatron is an aspect of Michael. According to Saint-Yves, the supreme head of Agartha bears the title Brahmatma, meaning the support of souls in the spirit of God, and his two adjuncts are Mahatma, or the representative of the universal soul, and Mahanga, or the symbol of the entire material organization of the cosmos. This would equate to the Western hierarchic division of spirit, soul, and body. Guenon notes that these words or names represent principles and thus are attached to the functions of the role and not to the individuals per se. Ossendowski says that the Brahmatma is able to speak face to face with God, that the Mahatma knows the events of the future, and that the Mahanga directs the course of these events. Thus, he is the king of the three worlds. The king of the world, as he comes forth from the temple, writes Ossendowski, radiates divine light. He is in contact with the thoughts of all the men who influence the lot and life of all humankind. He realizes their thoughts and plans. If these be pleasing before God, the king of the world will invisibly help them, but if they are unpleasant in the sight of God, the king will bring them to destruction. This power is given to Agartha by the mysterious science of Om, says Ossendowski, with which we begin all our prayers. Ossendowski writes that Om is the name of an ancient holy man, the first guru who lived 300,000 years ago. Guenon looks a little bit closer at the word Om, and he says that it provides a key to the distribution of the functions of Brahmatma, Mahatma, and Mahanga, in that the word contains 3 syllables, A, U, and M, which correspond to the 3 worlds mentioned earlier: earth, or Bhu in Sanskrit, that is the manifested world or domain of Mahanga; the atmosphere, or Bhuvas, that is the subtle or psychic manifestations and the domain of Mahatma; and the heavens, or Sva, that is the non-manifested principial world or the domain of Brahmatma. The Mandukya Upanishad, which discusses the symbol Om, says as follows: "This one, that is Om, is the Lord of all, this one is omniscient, this one is the inner director of all." At this point, Guenon adds an extension to this last phrase, which reads, "who resides at the center of the world and governs it from within." The Mahanga resides at the base of the initiatic triangle, the Brahmatma at the summit, and the Mahatma is the mediating principle, and all this is conveyed, Guenon asserts, in the monosyllable Om. To the extent that the Mahatma is the mediating principle, it embodies the priestly functions. The Mahanga embodies the royal power, and the Brahmatma, or the king of the world, embodies both. Guenon returns to the Magi kings of Christianity. The Mahanga is represented by the gold, or the royal power, the Mahatma by the incense, or priestly power, and the Brahmatma by the myrrh, the balm of incorruptibility, the symbol of the Amrita of the Hindus, the ambrosia of the Greeks, the Mazdian Hauma, or the Soma of the Vedas. Thus was homage paid to the newborn Christ by the authentic representatives of the primordial tradition in the 3 worlds, which are their respective domains. Guenon also mentions the tripartite divisions of powers or functions in Lamaism, in that the Dalai Lama realizes the pure spirituality of the Buddha, the Tashi Lama realizes his science or theurgy, and the Bogdo Khan represents his material or warlike strength. The idea of a spiritual center of the world manifests in many various sites throughout the world, and it turns out that many of these sites also present certain topographical peculiarities that have a symbolical value. One could call this an aspect of sacred geography. Another recurring motif is numerical symbols, such as, for example, especially the number 12, which corresponds to the zodiac, and we can find reference to this in traditions as apparently diverse as the 12 Namshams who make up the Dalai Lama's circular council and the 12 Knights of the Round Table. The inner circle of Agartha, as related by the 2 authors, Ossendowski and Sandiv, has 12 members. The 12 Adityas, who are the 12 forms of the sun, are relevant here, as Manu, the primordial guru of the age, is called the son of the sun, and the king of the world counts the sun among his emblems. It is said that the 12 suns appear simultaneously at the end of each cycle. Christ is given the title Sol Justitiae, meaning the spiritual sun. There are 12 apostles. The 12 tribes of Israel descended from the 12 sons of Jacob, all these linked to the 12-fold constitution of the spiritual centers. Hidden spiritual centers the world over bear close resemblance to one another. As Guenon says, the plausible explanation is that they must all be emanations from one supreme center, and are all thus adaptations from the one great primordial tradition. Guenon returns to the Knights of the Round Table, or more specifically to the Holy Grail and the quest for it. All traditions allude to something that from a certain time became lost or hidden, such as the Soma of the Hindus and the Persian Hauma or draught of immortality. This being connected in turn to the wine in the legends of Dionysus, the yayin of the Hebrews, the wine of the Sufis, and thus continues the connection of wine to initiatic tradition. These mysterious nectars in turn have a connection to the Grail, the chalice of the Last Supper, and thereafter to the blood of Christ, which it was said to contain, another draught of immortality. The blood poured forth due to the lance of Longinus, the lance being symbolical of the world axis. Among the Jews, it is the pronunciation of the full divine name that has been lost. There is also the lost word of the Masons. The chalice was said to have been carried to England by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. The chalice is told to have been formed from an emerald that dropped from Lucifer's forehead at the time of his fall, a symbol strikingly reminiscent of the pearl at the third eye of Shiva, which represents, Guenon says, the sense of eternity. This sense of eternity is deeply related to the immortality associated with the supreme spiritual center. Adam in the terrestrial paradise also is said to have possessed the chalice but lost it and the sense of eternity when he was driven from Eden. This sense of eternity is linked to the primordial state and is the first step in true initiation. The terrestrial paradise is another representation of the center of the world. Seth was able to temporarily re-enter the terrestrial paradise and recover the Grail. The name Seth expresses the idea of foundation and stability. Seth remained there for 40 years, a period representing the return to principle. We see it in the 40 days of Christ fasting in the wilderness, the 40 days of the deluge, the 40 days of Moses on Mount Sinai, the 40 years of the Israelites wandering, and so on. Thereby Seth and those who possessed the Grail after him were able to establish a spiritual center destined to replace the lost paradise. The loss of the Grail, or the word, or the name, or the nectar, amounts to the loss of tradition, or better to say that tradition becomes hidden, especially in spiritual centers that have lost contact with the supreme center. There are successive stages of spiritual obscuration that occur gradually throughout the different ages of the human cycle. The supreme center is never affected, however, by the course of the world or its events, and always preserves the tradition intact, though the majority of people can no longer participate in it in a conscious or effective manner. Such is the state of our present age. The table at the centre of the present myth was built by King Arthur according to Merlin's specifications and destined to receive the Grail. Arthur is the royal power and Merlin the priestly or sacerdotal power. Thus, the table is associated with a spiritual centre watched over by guardians of the tradition. Linked to the story of the Grail is that of Mont Salvat, the Mount of Salvation, rising out of the mist of the sea where no mortal can approach. Its description corresponds remarkably with that of Mount Meru. Mount Salvat is both the sacred isle and the polar mountain, symbols Guenon returns to later, and it is the land of immortality, identified with the terrestrial paradise. Dante placed the terrestrial paradise at the summit of the Mount of Purgatory, which for him is identified with the polar mountain in all traditions. Guenon now goes into some detail regarding Melchizedek. He relates it back via the aforementioned wine used in initiatic ceremonies, and notably to the sacrifice of Melchizedek. Melchizedek's sacrifice is usually regarded as a prefiguration of the Eucharist. The Christian priesthood is identified with the priesthood of Melchizedek. The name Melchizedek is, according to Guenon, none other than the title used in the Judeo-Christian tradition to designate the function of the King of the world. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. Melchizedek was therefore both priest and king. His name means King of Justice, and Salem connects him to peace. Thus again we have the two qualities mentioned earlier of justice and mercy. Salem, Guenon asserts, never represented an actual city, but rather the symbolic residence of Melchizedek. He is equating this symbolically now with Agartha. The temple was built by Solomon, whose name also derives from Salem. Salem was not the original name of Jerusalem, which was Jebus. Jerusalem was a tribute or visible image to the invisible Salem. Dante depicts Jerusalem as the spiritual pole in this manner. St. Paul described Melchizedek as one who lives, this equating him, Guenon says, with Manu, of whom it can be said he continues as a priest forever, for the entire duration of the cycle or Manvantara. Manvantara is the Vedic cycle of time. In the strictest sense, the name Melchizedek means the King of Justice, and the attributes proper to him are the scales and the sword, considered also to be the attributes of Michael, the angel of judgment. In the social order, these two emblems represent the administrative and the military functions and constitute royal power. In the spiritual order, it is the power of truth. Guenon concludes this line of thought by returning to the Shekinah and its representation in the inferior world by the last of the 10 Sephiroth, that is Malkuth, which means kingdom. A synonym used for Malkuth is Tzedek, or the just, and here we have the convergence of Malkuth and Tzedek and the name Melchizedek. Malkuth is the reservoir where the waters that flow from the river on high reunite. This river on high is reminiscent of the Ganga river and indeed Shakti of the Shekinah. The reservoir of celestial waters is identical with the spiritual center of our world, from where the 4 rivers of Pardes make their way towards the 4 cardinal points. The Jews identify the spiritual center with Mount Zion, which is the equivalent of Meru for the Hindus and the Alborz for the Persians. All the spiritual centers, constituted with a view to adaptations of the primordial tradition to determined conditions, are images of the supreme center. Traditions telling of a subterranean world are also found among many peoples. There is a common thread that could be called the cult of caverns, linked to the idea of a central place or an interior place. In this respect, the symbol of the cave and of the heart closely converge. The heart is the center of being. There have been many caverns and underground sites that have functioned through the aeons as initiatic centers. These sites are very suggestive of symbolism, but it may also be that the symbolism itself determines the choice of these sites in the first place, far more so than for reasons of prudence. In Judaism, there is the tradition of the mysterious city called Luz. This came from a dream of Jacob, a place he later named Bethel, or the house of God. The angel of death had no power over this place. It was a place of immortality. Near Luz there is an almond tree, at the base of which is a hollow, through which one enters the underground city. The same tradition exists among certain people of North America, whereby some people are also said to still live in the subterranean world. Luz, the word, in its various meanings, denotes hidden, secret, silent, covered. The word is also connected with the heavens, in that Latin words such as coelum mean both coverings and the heavens or sky. Luz is also said to be blue in colour, the sapphire city, the celestial colour. In India it is said that the blue colour of the atmosphere is as a result of the reflection from the south face of Mount Meru, which is said to be made of sapphire. The sapphire also frequently plays a role in the visions of biblical prophets. The 7 continents emerge during the cycles of time, and they form a lotus with Meru at the centre. One face of the mountain faces towards each continent, and these faces are the colours of the rainbow. The mountain itself is white. Many of these sacred central mountains are said to be white. Luz is also the name given to the indestructible corporeal particle, symbolically represented by an extremely hard bone, to which the soul after death remains linked until the resurrection. Note, the Luz is said to be located near the base of the spine, which is also the site of Kundalini in the Hindu tradition, which, when awakened, man recovers the sense of eternity or immortality. This Luz, in the Jewish tradition, contains all the elements necessary for the restoration of being, effected by the vivifying celestial dew. Thus, Luz is the kernel of immortality in the human being, while the city of the same name is the abode of immortality. Just as Luz is located in the lower portion of the human body and corresponds symbolically to the fallen state, the city with the key to immortality is located among terrestrial humanity in the subterranean world. Guenon mentions in this context the well-known Hermetic saying, "Visit the interior or inferior regions of the earth. In rectitude you will find the hidden thing, the stone, the true medicine." Back to Agartha. Agartha, it is said, was not always underground and will not always remain so. Ossendowski reports that a time will come when the people of Agartha will come up from their underground caverns to the surface of the earth. So said the King of the World, reported Ossendowski, when he appeared at the monastery of Narabanchi in 1890. Ossendowski also wrote that Agartha withdrew underground more than 6,000 years ago, which, as it happens, approximates the date of the beginning of the Kali Yuga. The loss of the word, or the draft of immortality, or the Grail, or the teaching, and so on, corresponds to the time of Kali Yuga. This is the time of obscuration and confusion. Initiatic knowledge must remain hidden. Even the most secret societies that transmit true traditional doctrine can offer no more than a pale shadow, as most conscious connection with the supreme spiritual center of the world has been ruptured. In biblical symbolism, this age of Kali Yuga is represented by the Tower of Babel and the confusion of tongues. Some few still possess what was hidden, others have the possibility to recover it, provided they search in the right way, that is, with the intention directed according to the law of concordant actions and reactions. The further the Kali Yuga progresses, however, the more difficult it becomes to establish contact with the Supreme Center, and as it becomes more hidden, so too do the secondary spiritual centers which represent it externally in the world. The center manifests anew at the end of each time period and at the coinciding beginning of the new Manvantara, for then terrestrial humanity returns to the primordial state. Guenon claims that in Europe at this time all links with the center are now broken for the past several centuries, he says. First, there was the destruction of the Order of the Templars and the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, who it is said withdrew into Asia, and then came the Renaissance and the Reformation, which completed the rupture. Ossendowski reports that the King of the World appeared several times in India and Siam, where he blessed the people with a golden apple with the figure of a lamb above it. Saint-Yves, in his book, speaks of the cycle of the lamb and the ram. In Christian symbolism, there exists representations of the lamb on the mountain from which 4 rivers flow, which is a clear reference to the 4 rivers of the terrestrial paradise. The name that Agartha bore before the Kali Yuga was Paradesha, which in Sanskrit means supreme country. From this word, the Chaldeans have Pardes, and in the West we have paradise. The mountain of the terrestrial paradise is identical with the polar mountain which exists in almost all traditions, the Meru of the Hindus, the Alborz of the Persians, Qaf of the Arabs, which cannot be reached by land or by sea, and the Greek Mount Olympus, for example. These mountains always exist in regions that are inaccessible to ordinary humanity, and beyond the reach of the cataclysms that beset the earth at the end of cyclical time periods. Though the Vedic texts do refer to the polar location of the central mountain, it is also polar in a symbolic sense, in that it is the fixed pole around which the revolution of all things is accomplished. The mountain, which is the center of the world before the Kali Yuga, withdraws underground during the period of obscuration. Other symbols of this center of the world include the Omphalos, which is found among nearly all peoples. The word means navel, and it denotes what is central, and especially relates to the symbol of the hub of the wheel. The root of navel is found in other languages, such as nabi in Sanskrit, nab in Celtic languages, nav or nabe in Germanic languages. It is sometimes a root sound even applied to God, denoting the central principle. The image of the circle is also everywhere a symbol in the world. The Omphalos denotes a center, not only geographical but also spiritual. The Omphalos in the temple at Delphi is the best known one, and this was the spiritual center for the Greeks. The Omphalos was generally represented by a sacred stone. Genesis records, "And this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall be God's house." The cult of stones was common to many ancient peoples, and it must be understood that it was not the stones themselves that were important, but rather the divinity whose dwelling place they were. The stone of Jacob, the menhirs among the Celts, the black stone of Cabela, the stones in the place of the oracle at Delphi, the stone in the Kaaba, these represent the spiritual center of the world. The stone could also take the form of a cone, reminiscent in shape of the polar mountain, the world axis. A related symbol is also the world egg. The symbol could take the shape of a mound or tumulus, the raised pyramids of China, for example. These symbols always represented the central hub, the central point. In Ireland, the country was formerly divided into 5 kingdoms, one of which bore the name Meath, which corresponds with the word in various languages for middle or centre. The kingdom of Meath was formed from portions of the 4 other kingdoms, and this central kingdom was the rightful domain of the High King, to whom all other kings were subordinate. At Uisneach, there still stands a stone, almost exactly at the centre of the country, which has been called the navel of the earth, all Namiran, the stone that marks the dividing boundaries of the 4 kingdoms which converge in Meath. This is related to the old name of the country, the Isle of 4 Masters, though this name has previously been applied to Ogygia or Thule, a far more northern land and one of the chief spiritual centres. The name St. Patrick was originally Corriga, which signifies the servant of the 4. This name, the Isle of 4 Masters, is found in other places as far away as China, for example. The 4 Masters are identical also to the 4 Maharajas of Indian and Tibetan tradition, which rule over the 4 cardinal directions, while the Supreme Master, representing ether or the Akasha, the quintessence, rules from the sacred mountain in the center. The supreme country, known in some places as Paradesha, has also been known as Tula, from which derives Thule, which was the original isle of the 4 Masters. Tula, the name place, is found in many places as diverse as Russia and Central America. The Mexican Tula owes its origin to the Toltecs, who came from Aztlan, the land in the middle of the waters. In Sanskrit, Tula means scales and is related to Libra, the sign of the zodiac. This relates back to the previous discussion regarding Melchizedek and justice or judgment. The actual location of the Supreme Center is an extremely complex question, according to Guenon. There seems to be good reason to presume a number of successive locations corresponding to different time cycles and to the different constitutions of the traditional forms. Likewise, many major centers can exist simultaneously with the principal one, reflecting it, and thus leading sometimes to confusion as they are the more visible. Guenon notes some similarity between Lhasa and Agartha. He also notes that at least 2 cities in the west, Rome and Jerusalem, display certain topographical circumstances suggesting a comparable raison d'etre. In ancient times, after all, there existed what could be called sacred geography, and the placement of cities and temples was not arbitrary. especially if such a city was destined to become a capital of a portion of the world. Plato's Timaeus appears to contain veiled allusions to this ancient science of sacred geography. There have been important centres that existed in pre-Hellenic Crete, several in Egypt, such as Memphis and Thebes. The very Ark of the Deluge was a representation of the supreme centre, ensuring the preservation of the tradition during the transitional period of cosmic cataclysm. The role of Noah is analogous to the role of Manu, though the time periods are not the same. Noah is also said to have been the first to cultivate the vine, harking back to the lost draught and the symbolic meaning of wine in initiatic ceremonies. Other names of the many potential candidates, apart from those already mentioned throughout the presentation, include Troy, Babylon, Bethlehem, Albion, Argos, and many others. Guenon does not come down in favour of any particular location. However, one conclusion that Guenon says emerges from the concordant testimonies of all traditions is that there is a Holy Land par excellence, and that it is the spiritual centre to which all others are subordinate. The Holy Land, the land of the saints, the land of the blessed, the land of the living, the land of immortality, the pure land, Plato's abode of the blessed, all these and more are situated in the invisible world, especially hidden now from profane view in the Kali Yuga. But nevertheless, as Guenon cheerfully concludes by quoting Joseph de Maistre, we must be ready for an immense event in the divine order, which we are travelling towards with an accelerated speed that must astound all those who watch. Redoubtable oracles have already pronounced that the time has arrived.